What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and I'm wearing a gray shirt today because we're talking about Grey Knights. Although they're silver, that doesn't make sense. This whole bit has been ruined. We're continuing talking about 10th edition faction review articles and talking about these psychic armies. We had Thousand Suns yesterday and Grey Knights today, and I'm so excited because we get to see what psychic powers and psychic effects are looking like in the 10th edition of the game. Very much like Thousand Suns, Grey Knights have been overhauled entirely. This faction is going to be basically unrecognizable from the 9th edition incarnation. Just like Thousand Suns, which saw some similar effects transfer over to the new edition, they can still use their Kabbalistic rituals, but they work much differently, and they have much different effects. Grey Knights have had some similar themes retained from 9th to 10th edition, but basically look entirely different. So comparing them directly to how they worked previously is basically not worth it. We'll just talk about them of their own merits, because this faction looks pretty cool. And that coolness starts off with their army ability, Teleport Assault. This is basically the combination of Gate of Infinity and Deep Strike, and all of their abilities that Grey Knights had to teleport and reposition themselves around the table over the course of the game in previous editions. That's always been Grey Knights' thing. The entire army can Deep Strike historically, and they've been able to Deep Strike themselves during the game with that Gate of Infinity. But now we have this Teleport Assault, which allows you to select a number of units depending on the battle size. In a Strike Force game, a normal 2,000 point game of 40k, that will be 3 units. At the end of your opponent's turn, you pick those up, and at the movement phase of your next turn, Deep Strike them 9 inches away horizontally of enemy models. Now, this timing is super weird and super important. Because it triggers at the end of your opponent's turn, you cannot use it during the first battle round. There's no way to teleport your stuff turn 1. This is important because it prevents turn 1 alpha strikes from the army. You're still restricted by reserve restrictions, but given that most of the army can Deep Strike, and it appears that unless we see some additional clarifications in other publications that you can Deep Strike on the first turn of the game in 10th edition, I actually don't know how big of a restriction this is. But what it doesn't let you do is reposition your units before your opponent has had the opportunity to take a first turn. Now, importantly, you can't pick units that are in engagement range with this ability, so you can't do the old classic Gate of Infinity teleport thing where you're stuck in engagement, you don't want to fall back, and you just pull them out and then Deep Strike them again. That doesn't work in this situation. They can only teleport if they are unengaged. So once you're engaged, you're locked in. Now, teleporting is the name of the game for this particular Grey Knights detachment, the Teleport Strike Force, which makes sense. I mean, it's in the name. And like we said, teleporting has been a Grey Knights thing forever, which is embodied by the fact that their detachment rule is Teleport Shunt. This ability is wild. It gives you auto 6 advances and the fly keyword when you advance. That means you can move over enemy models when advancing, and you can use the through the air traveling to move diagonally up to higher levels of terrain. So it gives Grey Knights much more flexibility when operating with terrain in mind and when positioning themselves around enemy models. Plus, which, according to the article, is every infantry model in the book. So that's good. Basically, like 90% of the army. Plus Nemesis Dread Knights. I think the only thing that's not going to be affected by this are like dreadnoughts and tanks. This is mostly a quality of life update, unless they have ways to advance and charge or advance and shoot. We haven't seen any assault weapons in the codex quite yet, but I'm sure there will be ways to interact with this. If we just see a stratagem to advance and charge, this teleport shot ability is going to be wild. Even then, it gives you the opportunity to lunge out, steal objectives, get yourself into annoying positions, travel up the table more quickly, and make units like interceptors incredibly strong. If you can move them 18 inches into a centrally located piece of terrain to defend yourself and then jump out with their long movement the next turn, that unit's going to be great. But you know what else is going to be great? Are the units that have been spoiled in this article. The first one we see is the Purgation Squad. These are the heavy weapon equipped Grey Knight Strike Marines. You don't see them too often. They're kind of a flex pick occasionally because they can take a pretty efficient load out of heavy psi weapons, but now they regain their Astral Aim ability. This was a nightmare in 8th edition, and while it got significantly depowered in their 9th edition codex, it was still a nice bonus to have. This allows them to gain indirect fire as long as the target of the weapon is visible to one or more friendly Grey Knight Psyker units. This is a situation where having that extra 6-inch advance or the ability to teleport yourself around the table with Teleport Assault is super relevant because you can get units in your opponent's backline into awkward positions, and importantly, there's no range characteristic on this ability. As long as you can see them from any distance, the Purgation Squad's going to be able to shoot them around corners. They will still be suffering that indirect fire penalty, so the target's going to gain cover regardless of whether or not they're in terrain, and you're going to get -1 to hit, but that's a small price to pay from being able to fire at units you wouldn't normally be able to, or fire from total safety yourself. The weapons that these guys are going to be firing are a selection of Grey Knight heavy weapons. We do see the Stormbolter profile here that we've seen in the past, and we see some profiles for the close combat weapons. They have normal close combat weapons with 3 base attacks. The Nemesis Force weapon that the unit champion's most likely going to have is a Psychic weapon with Strength 6 AP2, 2 damage. This is kind of an amalgamation of all of the different Nemesis weapons that the unit could take, and importantly, that now means that the Nemesis Force weapon that you had equipped on your model no longer matters, which is good, because I always equipped my models with whatever would looked best. So I would just have to tell my opponent what they were supposed to be, because I just like the look of halberds. I don't know, man, sue me. A Strength 6 AP2 weapon is pretty good, especially since there are going to be ways to buff it that we see later on in this article. The ranged weapons are really the headliner for Purgation squads, however. The Incinerator is a big flamer, firing D6 shots at Strength 6 AP1 that ignores cover and automatically hits with Torrent. The Silencer is a psychic weapon with sustained hits 1, shooting 6 times at Strength 5, and the Psy Cannon is also a psychic weapon that fires 3 times at Strength 8 AP1, 2 damage. Now, these heavy weapons leave a little bit to be desired. They're all kind of low AP, medium range, which is what we've expected. Hitting on 3s permanently without the heavy keyword is pretty good. A lot of other factions have had their heavy weapons given -1 ballistic skill, but then the heavy characteristics. So to get back to their old ballistic skill, they have to stand still. This is not the case for these Purgation squads, so they're able to move around pretty quickly without having any trouble. And like we said before, they're able to shoot through walls, which is great. I do wish the Psy Cannon was a little bit higher strength, however. It's supposed to be a kind of anti-light vehicle weapon, but at only strength 8 is going to be wounding a lot of vehicles on 5s, and at only AP1, 2 damage, it's not really going to leave quite a mark. I think these guys are pretty good at killing medium infantry or so, but if you're hoping to crack vehicles with them, I don't really know if they're going to reward you. That said, the ability to pick them up and drop them basically whenever you want is very powerful. So you could even be using things like incinerators to drop big units of Purgation squads and fire those auto-hitting flamers directly into your opponent's line. We've talked a lot about how powerful Toro weapons are in this game thanks to the interaction with the new Overwatch rules, and having a squad of 4 incinerators just being able to bully your opponent is pretty disgusting, especially given the fact that you can do that every turn, and so these Purgation squads can just keep jumping around, forcing a bunch of auto-hitting attacks onto your opponent, forcing them to deal with Overwatch, and constantly keeping the fear of the Emperor in them. Otherwise, the Purgation squad does have a pretty decent stat line, but with one important edit. They're T4 with a 6-inch movement, 2 wounds, a decent leadership of 6+, and a low OC value of 1, but they have been reduced to a 2+ save. So unlike the old version of the Aegis armor that we saw that gave them a 5+ damage ignore against mortal wounds, they've lost that and just gained a superior save against every weapon in the game. And if that carries on to every Grey Knight in the Codex, this army is going to be legitimately sticky to kill. Moving on, we have the Nemesis Grand Master. This guy has mostly been side graded in his defensive profile, going up to toughness 8, which is great against strength 4 attacks, much more resilient than it was in the past, but he's going to be the same or a little bit worse against heavy anti-tank hits. He retains his 2+ save, 13 wounds, and a high OC value of 4, alongside a 6+ leadership, which does feel a little bit low for a Grandmaster, but it is what it is. He has a Deadly Demise D3 ability. He can deep strike and make use of teleport assault, but really where things get spicy are his special abilities. He has the Surge of Wrath ability. This is a once per round psychic power that automatically manifests and is usable by one model in your army in the fight phase. If it uses it until the end of that fight phase, each time it attacks, every single melee hit it swings against monsters and vehicles gets reroll to hit, wound, and damage. A true Honest to the Emperor full reroll against those big things. So if we are trying to crack open monsters and vehicles, Nemesis Grandmaster does seem like the way to go. He also has the Heroism's Favor ability. This reduces the cost of any stratagems used on him to 1. This is every time you use a stratagem on him, not once per round and not limited in any way. And as far as I know, stratagem cost reduction does not interact with the limit of gaining 1 CP per turn. So you can use as many stratagems on him as you want for 1 CP each, as long as you have the CP to spend for it. This is especially useful for things like counteroffensive and heroic interventions that this guy's going to be able to do much cheaper than any other unit in the game. I imagine we'll also see some very expensive Grey Knight specific stratagems, and there are a couple in this article as well that will also be usable on him. Now, in terms of the weapons he's using to make those big full rerolling swings, he does have his option of Dread Fists, a Nemesis Great Hammer, or a Nemesis Great Sword. Unfortunately for him, he has been reduced in his weapon skill. All of these weapons hit on a 3, except for the hammer, which hits on a 4. So it's really banking on those full rerolls in order to actually convert its attacks reliably. The Dread Fist attacks 6 times at strength 6 AP1 for only 1 damage. Honestly, not that exciting, so probably leave those at home. The Nemesis Great Sword has a strike profile with 5 attacks at strength 10 AP2 D6 damage. This one does seem pretty solid. It's going to be wounding most vehicles on 4s, maybe 5s, but then full rerolling thanks to Surge of Wrath. The Sweep profile, however, swings 10 times, hitting on 3s at strength 5 AP1 for only 1 damage. And last but certainly not least, the Great Hammer has 5 attacks, hitting on 4s like I mentioned before, at strength 14 AP3, D6 plus 1. While the Dread Fists don't seem very good, the Great Sword is definitely useful as a kind of jack-of-all-trades profile, and the Great Hammer is good for just plowing through tanks. He can be damaged. Once he's down to 4 wounds, he gets -1 to hit, but he doesn't suffer any OC penalties. In terms of range attacks, he can mount Gatling Silencers, Incinerators, or Psy Cannons. These mostly retain the same weapon abilities that the foot version has. The Silencer has sustained hits 1, firing 12 times at strength 6 AP0 for 1 damage. The Incinerator shoots 2d6 times at an 18-inch range, ignores cover, and has the Torrent keywords at strength 6 AP1. And the Psy Cannon is strength 10 AP1 for 3 damage, firing 6 times. That one does seem pretty good. We're finally getting to the profiles where we do have the ability to crack a little bit of high toughness models. Importantly, the fight phase ability is only usable in 1 fight phase, and it's a fight phase only, so it doesn't interact with the shooting weapons at all. That is only going to affect his melee attacks. Speaking of weapons, we also see a little bit of psychic attacks from the Purifiers. Now, it looks like psychic attacks are going to be working much differently for units that have them in this new Grey Knights Codex. In this case, the Purifiers get a Purifying Flame attack that they can use in addition to their other weapons. So each model in a Purifier squad is going to be contributing additional attacks to the attack pool. Unlike previously, where a Grey Knight squad would just cast their spell and the whole squad would, I guess, conjoin their powers together and cast one single spell, the Purifiers instead just each individually shoot a little tiny spell, which makes much more sense when you think about it. In this case, the Purifying Flame is an 18-inch range one-shot weapon that hits on a 3 at strength 4 AP1 for 1 damage. That doesn't sound that great, except it ignores cover and has the Anti-Infantry 2+ ability. This grants it a critical wound on a 2+ against infantry. Now, it doesn't have these devastating wounds ability that we've seen with a lot of similar psychic powers like this, so it is just going to wound on a 2+ and your opponent has to save. But given that its AP1 ignores cover, it is going to be forcing units to reduce their save pretty substantially, regardless of what their saving characteristic is. Now, last but certainly not least, we do have some stratagems. The first one being Haloed in Soulfire. This one is used in your movement phase when a Grey Knight Psyker unit is set up on the battlefield, either through Deep Strike or Teleport Assault. It gives them an untargetability effect. They cannot be targeted by enemy ranged attacks unless the attacking model is within 12. Now, theoretically, this is not usable alongside Rapid Ingress, but we don't know that 100% for sure because we don't know exactly the timing of the game. So when you set up your unit in the movement phase, you do have to keep in mind that your opponent may be able to move up and shoot you afterwards. That said, I think this is for keeping units safe once they teleport in. You want to use your Teleport Assault to get yourself into kind of a mid-range of your opponent so that you then have a pretty decent shot of moving and charging them. And if you put them too close, your opponent is just going to blow them up and you potentially have a 9-inch charge. But if you can set them up in a pretty reasonable area where you can shoot at them, but make it difficult for them to shoot back at you because they can't get within 12, you're going to be able to teleport aggressively out in the open without fearing so much for your life. Especially being untargetable by ranged attacks is good, but not 100% safe, because we've seen a lot of effects. Like just yesterday, the Thousand Suns can still doombolt a model affected by Haloed and Soulfire. The other one we got is Radiant Strike, and this one is a little bit less exciting. It's usable only in the fight phase and targets a Psyker unit from your army, giving their psychic melee weapons Devastating Wound. Devastating Wounds is a wonderful ability to have. It turns your critical wound rolls into mortal wounds, but for the most part, we haven't seen units with a high attack volume that would make this super useful, or wound rerolls. If we can have a character or something attached to a unit and give them reroll to wounds in melee, so they have a greater chance of converting those 6s into mortal wounds, that's amazing. And if we see effects like Heroism's Valor reduce the cost of the stratagem since it is 2 CP, so it's usable more often, that's also going to be amazing. Outside of those situations, unless you really need mortal wounds, I'm not 100% sure that this is a great stratagem. At 1 CP, it would be solid. At 2 CP, it's a lot. And so with that, that is the Grey Knights article. A really interesting side grade from previous versions of the Grey Knights army. And the design team even confirms that the majority of the army is going to be increased to that 2+ save at the bottom of the article. This is going to make them a lot stickier to kill, and if they remain a relatively elite army, that's super duper useful. A 2+ save in this new universe of relatively low AP values is going to be a really big deal, especially when they can get into cover, go to a 1+ armor save, unless of course cover works differently than we know, and go to a 1+ armor save and be very resilient against low to mid AP shooting. This army is going to be great. Excited to see the rest of the Grey Knights faction. Again, I think there's some other open questions that we have there, especially other characters and units that could benefit from that Radiant Mantle stratagem, but so far, I'm liking what I'm seeing. But let me know down in the comment section what you think about it. Big thanks as well for watching all the way to the end of the video. Thanks to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, and Twitch subscribers. All you people are great and I love you. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and I'm happy wargaming.